Hello everyone. Today we are going to discuss about routing in MVC. So let's start without wasting any time. So in this routing, we will be discussing what is routing, how it basically works, what are the routing tables, right? So let's start without wasting any time. Routing, routing is basically a pattern matching system. Let's suppose whatever we are typing in the URL in the browser, and that request basically goes to the server, right? And on the basis of that particular URL, server decide what it has to return to the client or browser, right? So the process of this, when server decides that what it has to do and what it has to return, right? So that basically process is called routing. Let me give you one more scenario that let's suppose we have type any URL in the browser and that request goes to the server. In on the server side, the request basically goes to which controller and to which action method. So that is all basically done by this routing, right? Routing basically decides with the help of routing table that that particular request has to go with that has to go which controller and which action method, and accordingly the action is taken by that particular action method what it has to return on the view, right? As you can see on the screen, that routing is pattern matching system that is used to map the incoming request which is coming from the browser to the particular resource that is corresponding to controller and action method, right? uh, let's say we are having this URL. We can see this domain.com. This is the format how we type in the URL. First will be your domain name, then your controller name, then your action method name. This is what we normally does in the normal MVC application. But in the real scenario, typing directly the controller and action method, that's not a good approach. That's not a right thing. So type on the URL. So instead of this, we used to do like this: domain, as you can see, domain.com. Then simply we need to type contact us. I am just giving you this one of the example that that shows when the request will come from browser to the server. So the routing table will decide that it has to go on the home controller and the contact action method, right? So all this mapping is done in this routing table, right? So how this is done? It is done with the help of routing. So let me give you, let's move on to next slide. You can see in the diagram. So in the diagram, we can see that the request is being sent from the client to the server side, right? And what we have learned till now, that whenever the request is sent from the client to the server, the request basically goes to the controller first, right? This one controller, and then a- after receiving the request on the controller, that to which action method it has to go. So accordingly, that action method decide it has to return view with the help of this model, and we give the response back to the client. So this is what we have learned till now. But in the real scenario, this is not the actual thing which is being done behind the scene. If you see in the diagram, when the request is being sent from the client to the server, so before it goes to the controller, the request basically goes into this routing, right? And here the concept of routing comes into the picture. In the routing table, that this routing decides that to which controller and action method it has to hit, right? So this is the main scenario how the routing comes into the picture and how routing works. So let's move to the next slide. You can see in the diagram, when the request is coming from the browser to the server, so at server side, that particular request is being passed, right? The URL, whatever we are receiving URL in the request, right? So that particular request is being passed, right? And after parsing the URL, that request is basically goes to the routing table. And in the routing table, each incoming request is mapped with the controller and action method, right? So let's suppose we are receiving this URL, and after parsing the URL, it will find in the routing table that the incoming request is basically mapped in this routing table or not. So if the request match is found, then it basically goes to the that particular controller and action method. And if the request doesn't found in the routing table, then the application will return 404 error, that is page not found. So this is how routing basically works behind the scene on the server side. All these things which is happening in this diagram, you can see this is basically happening on the server side, right? And the routing table is the main table in which all the mapping is done, right? And all the incoming requests are being mapped in this routing table, and this routing table decide that particular request has to go which controller and action method. And if it is if that particular request is found, then the control will go to that particular controller and action method and will do the stuff and will return back to the client or browser. And if the request isn't found in the routing table, so the application will return HTTP error 404, that is not found, right? Next, let's move to the next slide. What we can see in the diagram that what exactly is, oh sorry, not diagram, I have just given you the description about route table. What is route table? Basically, we define route for each action method, right? And all the route information are stored in the route table, which we have discussed just a few minutes back. And each incoming request is mapped to this routing table, right? And the same thing, if a URL match is found, then the request goes to the specific controller action method, and if it doesn't found, then the application will return this 404 error, page not found. So in a normal scenario, we have two types of routing available. First one is your conventional routing, that is your traditional approach, right? And the second one is your attribute routing. But nowadays, uh, from MVC 5 version and the later version after MVC 5, we used to do deal with attribute routing, right? This first one is a very that's a very older approach, and that's very complex, right? And attribute routing is very simple. We need to apply attributes on the controller action method, and we can simply apply the routing, right? At this point of time, if you're not getting, don't worry. In the upcoming videos, we will be doing a practical in the Visual Studio, so that you will be easily you can easily understand how it basically works, right? So as of now, you understand that we have two types of routing. First one is your conventional routing, and second one is your attribute routing. So that's it. That was a brief introduction about routing. And please like and subscribe my channel, friends, and so that you can get all the latest notification in the upcoming future. And please also share with your friends, and please also press the notification icon. So that is all for this. Let's meet in the next video. Bye bye.